Coordinator here at CSUDH in the Office of International Education. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hamoud Salih, who will, he's the Senior International Officer in the Office of International Education, and he is going to introduce Dr. Jarrett. So, Dr. Salih.
Thank you, Armand, and for organizing this series. We are in our maybe 12 or 13 lectures now. This is our second year, and I can't thank you enough for keeping this and giving us a good program all this past year and a half. Today is very special. Dr. Brian Jarrett is our speaker. Dr. Brian Jarrett is a good friend of mine. We've worked together on so many years, I think since he has been here on campus. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Doctor, Professor, and Director of the Negotiation, Conflict Resolution, and Peacebuilding Program here at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Dr. Jarrett has led this program for the last 10 years or so. I think it's been 10 years or more, Brian, but you could let us know when you can correct me later. He has helped develop a strong program geared towards practitioners and academicians, those who with interest in conflict resolution, arbitration, mediation, and peace building. This gave a new character to the program, and it set it on the right path based on his vision and the vision of the CSUDH. Dr. Jarrett's approach to conflict resolution is multidisciplinary and comprehensive, as evidenced by his approach to the mediation. His integral approach is rooted in the community work and the experience that he has had working with several groups at all levels of society. He challenges what one might call mainstream mediation approaches, which is limited in its scope by looking only by advancing or expanding mediation to be a community endeavor, and that involves addressing multifaceted issues along with providing a theoretical framework that is adaptable to mediation circumstances and pragmatism. In other words, the approach links theory to practice and makes it more relevant to the need of the community or the issue at hand. The same can be said about Dr. Jarrett's work and interest in restorative justice. This is an approach that has been with us since the 1970s. Dr. Jarrett is one of the leading scholars in this area. As field of study, his restorative approach is seen as the best approach to address social injustices. As I mentioned earlier, the approach started in the 70s. It advocates for alternative resolution to the traditional model of justice that we came to know in the West, which basically focuses on punishment and retribution as best remedy to bring justice. Restorative justice goes beyond that by taking into account all those impacted with the goal of rendering a just solution or a justice that would heal the community as a whole, not just that incident or focusing just on the punishment and retribution. I can speak of personal experience. I have known Brian for many years now. I can tell you that every time I met him, it's always a pleasure. It's fascinating. His ideas are amazing, but he never veered away from this idea of adapting academic or theory to practice. I relate to that very well. As a social scientist, I always viewed that addressing political issues by faculty drive us into more theory than practical things. So Brian does that beautifully. Brian enjoys working with Indigenous peacemakers and communities, supporting their work in the rediscovery of traditional restorative justice and practices. Each year, Dr. Jarrett facilitates the International Conference on Dispute Resolution, which brings together peacemakers, dispute resolution, practitioners, researchers from all around the world. So please welcome, help me welcome Dr. Brian Jarrett. It's all yours, Brian. Thank you for coming today to lead us in this lecture.
Thank you, Hamoud. I really appreciate that. And thank you to you, Armand, and for working with me to put this on and making this talk possible. Also to people coming in at 10 a.m. here, thanks very much for listening to this and your interest in the restorative area. Today, with this talk, we're going to go to Alaska. We're going to be in Alaska and looking at 2 programs in Alaska. And these are programs that are working with and part of local communities in Alaska. And so the focus will be looking at the one program that worked versus another one that wasn't as successful. In both situations, the people involved were honorable people, good people, really did outstanding work, were decent. But in one situation, they took one approach. In the other community, they took another approach. And then we're going to look at the difference, and it gives us some learning for practice and implementation, and for communities, people involved in the professional end who are helping those communities, and also those communities themselves, most importantly, to recognize that there are ways to do things that work better than other ways. And so we'll be looking at that difference. So that's the focus of the talk. So, welcome to everybody. And I will now, I'm looking to share the screen. Here we go. I have a PowerPoint slide I want to tell you about and show you. And here it is. It's coming on the screen, hopefully. Voila. So the 2 programs are titled, the first one's the Upper Tanana Wellness Program. And it's the program that was introduced by a magistrate, local magistrate, well-meaning local magistrate in the Upper Tanana region. I'll tell you about that in a second. A really good guy introduced this, but it wasn't as successful as the second program, the Tlingit Circle Peacemaking Program. The Tlingit Peacemaking Program is in Cake, Alaska, and we'll see that little village, and I'll show you it on the map. It's the one that really worked well and still working well. And we'll look at the differences, as I say. Let's go to a map of Alaska, just so you can see where things are. So if you look at this map, you'll see that there is a, if you can see the pointer, I hope that's coming across. This is where the road is in from Alaska to Canada. So, and here's the Yukon border, and the Yukon side, Canadian side, and then the Alaskan side. That road there, that region is called the Upper Tanana region. And there are a number of native villages around that region. The road continues all the way to Whitehorse, but the map was written by Americans, so it doesn't show the road on the Canadian side, but there is a road. It's that same road. It goes right through Whitehorse and then down into British Columbia. That road, by the way, is gorgeous. It's a beautiful place to go. The hiking around there, the scenery is absolutely gorgeous, and a wonderful place. That's the Upper Tanana program. That wellness program was in the village of Northway, another village called Toke, the town of Toke, the village of Northway and surrounding villages. That's the Upper Tanana Wellness Program. That's where it's designed to work with restorative, cases. You go down into the Panhandle. That's down here, and you'll see my little pointer. Down there, just around this island here, Kupreanof Island, there's a little village called Cake. That's the Tlingit Peacemaking Program. It's in that little village in the Panhandle, just right around there. And you can't get to that village by a road. You have to fly in, or you have to take, the ferry, or you can take the cruise ship or canoe, boat, whatever, but you can't get in by a road system. So, by the way, the capital, Juneau's down there too, and it's not on the road system either. You have to take a boat ferry to get there. Now, so that's already a distinction. So from in the upper Tanana region, you'll see that there's a road, you can drive right to these villages. But in the summer, in the winter, it gets more difficult, right? It gets quite cold in there. So in the upper Tanana region, there's a road system to the villages, but it also gets extremely, get kind of cold in there when you're driving through. And if your car stops and doesn't start again, and it's 50 below, it's a little harrowing, a little scary, because you think, wait, 15 below, and my car's not starting, and I'm alone in one, in one of these, in the road somewhere there, and maybe other cars aren't coming along for a while. So that's a bit of an interesting experience, and it's, of course, in the summer it's beautiful, and and it's gorgeous, and it's easy to travel around. The winter gets difficult. So, but in the southwest here of Alaska, down in the Panhandle, it's much more moderate climate, and it's moderated by the ocean currents and so forth. So it's actually much all year round. It's more moderate, more British Columbia weather, connection. So there's the sort of a geographical connection that's interesting to just to think about in terms of where these villages are. And so here's some of the views. That's how you get up to Cake, around Cake. These are what the views look like. It is absolutely stunning and gorgeous. And we're so lucky to have this, on our planet. It's just absolutely gorgeous. This is what it looks like often in the summer, the spring. And here's the northern lights. Regularly, you see these in the sky, particularly in the upper Tanana region, Fairbanks, around there, always see the northern lights. Just absolutely gorgeous. But you can see when the snow's on the ground, it's much more difficult to get around. So villages can often be isolated. We can often feel kind of hemmed in a little bit because of the winter. And so the community connection is actually stronger because of that. People are much aware of each other, because often you need other people to survive, to do okay. So you need to rely on your neighbors. So there's a different dynamic from a large city or a town in the lower 48, for example, where you have metropolis. Okay, so here's just some facts, some background facts about Alaska, and that give you a bit of context in which these programs came about. So in Alaska, we have Alaska bought from the Russians in 1867. That's the same date as the Canadian Confederation, by the way, where Canada becomes a country, basically. And you've got then the drawing of that boundary between, solidifying of the boundary between Alaska and Canada. And also you have the politics that play up around all of that through 1959, where as late as 1959, Alaska becomes a state. So it took a while for Alaska to become a state. And it's, 1959 is really, if you think about that, that's, it's almost 1960, right? So the hippies, right, that era, 1959, wow, okay. Population of Alaska, this is of 2015 or so, when we wrote this article, which we have make available to you. The population was 738,000. Population of Alaska Natives is 18% roughly. And people in prisons in Alaska, it's 36, the Alaska Natives account for 36%. So you can see then it's double the rate, the percentage of the population, right? And in about 2014 or so, there was a President Obama commissioned a report of Native communities, villages, and the tribes. And basically in Alaska, that report found that there was no effective policing in over 80%, 80 villages, like in over 80 of those villages, often unavailable, disconnected, like they're not on the road system. So they're not easily connected to, can't just drive a police car to one of those villages. And over 80 of those villages did not have effective policing. So that, you could think of, for example, young people committing crimes, persecuting or hurting an elder or something, or some domestic thing, and the police not being able to respond to help, that community out, that elder out, that individual person in that village. So it makes it even more important to think about restorative practices in that context, because the policing really needs to be improved to those villages, for those communities, for people in the communities to feel safe in that community, can go about their business in daily life. So it's an important place for restorative practices, because now we can see, wow, this is, we really need to have intervention, not just restorative, but of course, generally discussion of law enforcement. But one part of that needs to be the focus on the restorative in order to deal with matters that could really help those communities. So we can talk about any of this in questions, but I'll just give you the overview. And okay, so just some other important historical events, and some of these are, this is a bit of history that's important to know. The Great Death, people refer to the Great Sickness and the Great Death. Flu, influenza, it killed many people, many Native people in Alaska, particularly around 1918, when you had to remember the Spanish flu. Just we think about COVID now. The Spanish flu, it went around the world, but it really devastated people in Alaska. And I was reading some villages are the 70% of the population would die. In others, it would be all that the villagers would disappear. So this is a historical event for people in Alaska of great significance, and people refer to that. It's in the memory of, collective memory. The other thing that happened was, legally, as the 1959 to get statehood, the American legal system then is, Anglo-American legal system is implemented, and so you get, for example, outlawing of certain practices like potlatch and peacemaking. And potlatch was actually it was a form of peacemaking, actually, where when somebody dies, for example, the community gets together, and that family will then give away items to the other families, people in that village that they want to give things to. And it's a form of reciprocal altruism. It's a form of giving back and forth to people in the community. And so that helps to build and strengthen a community. So when there are issues, that they can be brought up, and people resolve those in the potlatch. It's a practice. I've been to Polly Hyslop, invited me out to Northway, and sort of watched this experience, and it was really something to see. Because you think, well, this is it's like in a movie or something. No, it's really true. People practice potlatch, and it's an interesting practice. It's very real in its effects, and you can see, wow, this really has this kind of social cohesion, solidarity function. It really helps people to think about each other and the community and so forth. So that was actually outlawed, and the same with peacemaking generally. There are different peacemaking practices and ceremonies, and they were outlawed. Only they've been brought back now, and people thought, oh, people realized that this is not a healthy thing to do. In fact, these practices were useful and can be, implemented. They can be connected to the courts, the legal system. That many of these ceremonies and practices, there's no, incompatibility with the court. These can be connected. The practices can be, judges can refer to these practices once they get to know about them and so forth. So there was a a view that those things couldn't, this the Anglo-American legal system, and it was not able to connect with local practices, ceremonies, peacemaking. And now we're finding, well, that wasn't true, actually. In fact, these things are compatible. There are things that can be worked out. It takes a little bit of work, to how things would connect, but they are useful. They're workable. It just works. So now there's one other thing event I should tell you about too, and that is the boarding schools. These are the, in Canada, they're called residential schools. In Alaska, they're called boarding schools. And in the lower 48, they're called boarding schools too. And this was where Native kids were taken out of the family and raised apart, separate and apart in a school. And those conditions of those boarding schools were not always, healthy. In fact, in a number of the instances in those schools, the kids were abused or sexually or physically or, taken out of their natural parent environment. And the idea was on some people, this is a mixed thing, because some people obviously meant well. The churches were involved in this. And so they were thinking this would be helpful to the kids. On the other hand, there were a number of people who had more nefarious motives. And I think, a lot of harm was done to those kids and families as a result of that. So on balance, it did very negative effects on families and so forth. So what are those effects with the boarding school? Just to give you a quick list of these, some of the ideas that connect with social science you might see in social science. We talk about the idea of the intergenerational fracture, that when you break parenting skills in one generation, the future generations, people don't have those skills because they get fractured. So then, the parent-child bond in one generation gets fractured. It has an effect, a ripple effect. So in future generations, it's hard to know how to parent because you didn't get parented, so you don't know how to do it. So that takes a while to develop. You get it back. It's interesting because it sort of connects with I often hear from my Native friends this idea of the seventh generation, things what you do now is affect 7 generations or more, at least down the road. And so these things have effects and they run into the future generations. So that sort of intergenerational break or fracture in the parenting was not good for people. And then you lose norms, healthy norms get lost in there. Cultures, traditions, practices. You get a loss of identity, the idea that you don't know who you are. You get lost in the wondering which way is up and down, loss of your own value, that people lose a sense of their own value because of the, sending off to a school. Then, so when you hear the interviews of people who've been through the boarding school experience, it was pretty rough for a lot of those people. So social dislocation, you don't feel connected to other people, institutions, community. And then there is research on this. The guy that really I recommend to you is Dr. Mehmet Volkan. Dr. Volkan is a Turkish psychiatrist, and he's been doing the circuit now in the States also. And he does a lot of work on historical trauma and how the trauma is whatever's not worked out in the current generations, where events happen and people are traumatized by the events. You think of COVID, now will be one of the ones we'll be able to talk about later. But that whatever's not worked out in the current generation is it's visited on generations down the road. And so then people having to work out those issues that weren't worked out by the previous. Now, it wasn't that the previous generations were just kind of sitting around, I don't want to work this out. No, it's too painful. So it's too much pain, too much to look at. So what they do is you repress it and then you push it on down the road. And so then it connects, it shows up in future generations. That's true of everybody, by the way, that I believe. And it's true of all communities. But we see it in particular, as Vamek points out, in this environment, in the I believe this really accounts for what's going on, that trauma is brutal and it has lasting effects, ripple effects down the road. So it has to be addressed. Now, there are people in positive psychology and others that talk about post-traumatic growth, and that it is actually, you can see people in great trauma and they come out of that trauma and they are stronger, and so you see that as a psychological fact that people can get stronger from trauma. So, and we're seeing that in these villages that Polly will talk to this. She comes on, Polly Heislop, who's the person I worked with, talks about how that people have survived, the fact that they're getting stronger as a result of these experiences. And it's something that, we can look at and these villages, people involved, leaders can see as something that actually will support Native Alaskans and others in these circumstances. So it can't be emphasized enough, the point about historical trauma and how that influences and has ripple effects and influences people down the road. Now, there's terms in social science that people recognize, like anomie, Durkheim's term, anomie, absolutely, that you see that this going on, in my view. You see alienation, many different takes on alienation, left to right, all the different views of alienation. You do see that as well. Social strain, trauma leads to suicide, high numbers of suicides. And you see people often will retreat into alcohol and drugs when there's the effects of trauma. So this gives you a little bit of the social science side of things, the theory, for those interested in that. So going back to these two programs, if we look at how the programs came about and how they were implemented, you can start to see why one was successful and what the other one wasn't in addressing these kind of problems we've been talking about. So the first program is the Upper Tanana Wellness Program. It struggled, and there the magistrate, Dave Roquer, good guy, and there was a wellness committee. But the wellness committee so Dave he was at the time a magistrate in the town of Tok, which the magistrate for that area, for the Upper Tanana. And the wellness committee was made of people from the village, from the town of Tok, but it wasn't made up of people people who were having input from the villages themselves. So it was more centralized in it was well-meaning, and it was supported by a Department of Transportation grant. It was like $50,000 a year or something like this to support the program. And people in the villages weren't opposed to it, but it was more centralized. It was really developed in the town of Tok, Alaska, and was designed to help the villages, well-meaning. And but Dave Roquer, by the way, I just saw that in 2021 he got appointed as a Superior Court judge, and so he's going on and doing good work, and he's a good guy. The committee met well, and Polly Heislop was on that committee, the wellness committee, and I was invited to work with them as well. And it was, again, I can't say enough good things about the people involved. But if you look at that program, it struggled, and right now it's in hiatus. And Polly is thinking of we could bring it back and work on, talking to people about bringing it back. But the program that really was successful was in Cake, Alaska, in the Panhandle. That's the Tlingit Circle Peacemaking Program. It was sustainable. It's still going. It's successful. And it was developed from the ground up, from the community base. So their magistrate, Mike Jackson, was a magistrate of the state court system. He was also an elder in the Tlingit community, and also a member of the community, and had many leadership positions in the community. And he invited Harold Gattensby and Phil Gattensby from Carcross, Tagish First Nation. That community is also Tlingit. And so in that situation, from there on the Canadian side, in Carcross near Whitehorse, that's the town we saw, basically they came over, that's Phil and Harold, came over to Community and Cake. And Mike said when he was, when they were forming this program, he said he didn't know if it would be successful. But what really made it work was the fact that when Harold and Phil came over, Harold said, when they had their meeting, town hall meeting, he said, let my words fall down on your head like the feathers in the sky, right? In other words, and that was an expression in Tlingit culture, tradition, practice that was meaningful. It meant, it's set back not to be judgmental, but actually to listen carefully. And the fact that they were also Tlingit, but they'd been divided by the border arbitrarily, right? Through the 1959 border and all that. People were nomadic, by the way. They wandered around. They didn't stay in one space. So they actually, the boundary became somewhat for them, and then, divided communities and people. Anyways, once they did that, the community, that's when Mike Jackson said, well, the community just lit up. They just got it. They understood that the way to do this would be to bring back and look at their own practices, that people have been doing peacemaking for many years. In fact, in Tlingit culture, there are people who are identified early on, even as kids, they're identified as people who have the mediation or, restorative peacemaking skills. And then they're developed. And in certain families, people are known as the deer people, the people who just have this ability to help others resolve disputes. And it was a well-known practice. It was historical knowledge. And so then they started to talk about historical knowledge and piece things together. And so this is a great story because, while Mike was in the court system, as a magistrate judge in the courts, regular state court system, he also had a foot in the traditional practices. And so he was able then to encourage the community to have the court, we kept the court system, of course, but he was able to bring in the cultural practices for a peacemaking, circle peacemaking, that then they implemented in that community. So they did it really from cultural practices, from traditional practices, but they didn't exclude the court system. They didn't stand as activisms against, the courts, and the Alaskan courts are awful. No, what they did is say, we've got a problem here. We need to resolve. We're going to work on it. We'll work with the court system, but we'll do it based on traditional knowledge and cultural practices. And so I think that combo of thinking brought it to life and made it successful. And the Superior Court judge, by the way, went out to, Mike invited the judges out there to sit in the community, to be part of the community, to be, get to know what they wanted to do. So it wasn't thumbing their nose at the court system, saying we're going to do something different. No, it was, okay, we're going to work on this, and we're going to invite you in to see that these practices are useful. And then how could they be connected so that the judges could then work with and refer people to the circle, for example. So Mike would refer people to the circle. There was a keeper of the circle, facilitator, who would help the discussions. And so that was his approach. And I think it's a hallmark of a successful approach, that it's sort of a very careful, smart, people-oriented approach. And it really is inviting people in. It's not about alienating, so it takes leadership to do this. And Mike was there to do that. But here's the thing: it wasn't just that Mike was able to do that because of his position and so forth. It was the fact he drew on the traditions that then people in the community would support what he was trying to do. And then so the program became built from the ground up. It was developed from the ground up. So, and with community input and discussion of traditions. And that made a huge difference. So anyways, we need to give a little bit of recognition here to Harold Gattensby and Phil, his brother, Phil Gattensby, from the Yukon. And and to Mike Jackson, Magistrate Mike Jackson, and also to the people in the upper Tanana program, because they were well-intentioned as well, but the way they did is they implemented the program from a grant down, sort of top down, and then it struggled to get people who wanted to use it. So all of the people are doing a good job. You know, let's be good to everybody here. But the approach, ground up instead of top down, and grounded in local practice, culture, history, discussion of traditions, and also willingness to work with the courts, that was the combination that really made a difference. And so this program has been, like the CAKE program, has been studied by researchers from Harvard and the fancy universities and all that. And it comes up every time. Oh, this is something to this. This works. So CAKE, they went from the highest suicide rate in the nation for that small size village, the highest suicide rate in the nation, in the US, to practically now, and they haven't had suicides, no suicide. From the highest, from high crime rates to reduced, significantly reduced crime rates. And also a greater sense of the community cohesion and so forth, solidarity, as a result of the practice is having these circles. So we see a lot of benefits, and this is sort of the example. And again, it doesn't set itself apart, say, no, we're not going to work with the courts. They do work with the courts, but they recognize that in matters of crime, often youth crime, like young people, that if they can have a circle, they can address matters early on in that young person's life, so that then the person doesn't go off to what people call criminal university, where they end up getting, learning the culture of criminality, coming back to the village, and then, preying on people, elders, whoever it is. So that approach works early on in the village to address these matters. And in the circle, you might have, you have elders, you could have a school teacher, you could have, other people who were involved with crime, but they now are looking at their lives and they want to, contribute to the community, so they participate. You could have, you could have lawyers in there. You could have really anybody in the community they believe would be helpful to talk in that circle. They will bring into the circle. So, and the approach is based on health. The focus is health. It's a wellness and health. It's not the punitive approach that we often see with, in the standard criminal justice model. And so, interestingly though, somebody pointed out, they actually, because people are in the circle and everybody knows that person in the circle, it's better than a probation officer, because, elders will know, people will be, they're looking at seeing that young person, whoever it is, and then the person may have certain jobs or tasks that they have to do. So people are checking, oh, did that person do that? What, so there is actually a good measure of accountability in these circles that people don't realize. We could discuss that too. But anyways, the big point is the Upper Tanana Wellness Program really was top down. The CAKE program was really developed from the ground up in traditions. CAKE was successful, Upper Tanana struggled. So if you look at dispute systems design, this whole field now we have, it's called dispute systems design, DSD. People use this term DSD for short. It was developed actually it's in the labor industry, and it was in the mining, West Virginia, the mines. There were the violence and the people killed each other. There were all kinds of things going on in that sector, in that area. And so people got together, management and labor, and they got out in front of disputes and said, look, let's meet now. If we have a problem, let's figure out what to do about it so nobody has to die or nothing's burnt down, or we can do things that actually help. So it's called dispute systems design. Designing, that's where it comes from. Designing principles that will help community. In that case, it was the labor environment that it came from. Now, So Polly Heislop and I, this is in the article, we can give you the link to. We actually came up with looking at because we thought, geez, you know what Mike and the community were doing there was really in alignment with dispute systems design. So we could sort of figure out what those principles are. And so we came up with a few principles, and these are 9 in total. And this is an ongoing discussion. Anybody can add a principle, or take away, or just argue the principle. But the idea is that we came up with 9 points of reference that we saw really are useful thing, guideposts for whether a program would work well or not. One is if it's community-based. And so we talked about that, the tradition, and then Harold and Phil coming over from the Yukon to Mike and the Cake community. There they were really looking at basing their work in the practices in dispute design, the traditional peacemaking. So the other thing too is, number 2 here is that if you look at it, there was any movement like restorative justice, or you look at any alternative medicine, whether it's okay, we've got this great idea. Oftentimes there's a zeal to want to have a one-size-fits-all, and we recommend against that. Polly and I recommend against that, because what we're noticing is that these programs generally work best when they're tailored to the particular community that they're in. And you can see Cake as an example, because Mike, the community tailored their approach to traditional peacemaking as was taught and passed down in the Tlingit tradition. So you can see that's why it was connected with people. It landed, with people. There is Polly and I have noticed that there is, and there has been a kind of a political move in Alaska to kind of figure out one peacemaking thing, call it peacemaking, and say, this is how you do it. It's standard form peacemaking, and then taking a model and just applying it everywhere. And so we were skeptical of that, because every community is different, and so you want to allow different communities to develop their own way of doing things, but it would still connect, of course, with the court system, work with the judges, and do all the liaison work, the social capital work, and so forth. But it would work locally, and it would be developed on local principles, and it might vary in some ways from other communities, because people have different traditions. So to lump everybody in the same tradition or practice is folly, because they're not the same, and so they're not. That's a Hollywood version of reality. It's not real in practice. And so we thought the best thing would be to really encourage people against the idea of a one-size-fits-all, and even the state, people in the political side of things, to let people know that's a bad idea, because in the long run you're going to actually take away from the efforts of people to develop a local program that's connected to traditional practices and values. So I think that's message is landing actually with people in the political sphere. People are getting that. And they're also getting the idea that these things can work in conjunction and in concert with the courts and so forth. So there's some real positive front there to work on. People of of goodwill coming together to develop these programs. But in Cake, Alaska in particular, you really do see that, because there they developed the local program based on local practice. In Upper Tanana, the committee was attempting to build sort of a system, not really, even they went to the Yukon, to people working in government in the Yukon, Val Binder and so forth, excellent, really good people. They had a model of victim offender mediation, but it was actually from New Zealand originally, and they family group conferencing and so forth that they brought up, and they were trying to, mix principles. And it again, Val Binder, fantastic, was a great trainer, and committed her life to the restorative work, so terrific to see, and just a real recommendation to her, and respect. But on the other hand, for people to develop these programs, it is useful to develop them in the community, from the ground. So that's our point there. So The other thing is you have to look at historical context when you're building these restorative programs. And Mike did, again, Kate, they did that. They were very careful to get people to speak about practices, history, culture, how things had been done. And so then you get to see the larger picture of traditions. You also get to see the things we're talking about, like the residential boarding schools, the effects of those. People have a place for discussing that. The great death, the great sickness, these things that are very meaningful and tragic events, but they have to be addressed in order to get past and move on and build and go into the future, right? So this allows you to do that when you broaden out the picture and you look at why things are going on where they are. Also, we think it's important to encourage agreements between state court and tribal courts, state entities and the tribal entities. Let's sit down, let's talk, get people talking, because it's you can work things out surprisingly. There's a lot of goodwill that people don't realize is out there, because we often hear from the extremes in the media and the news, but there are many people on all sides that are people of goodwill. And I think we have to recognize that and recognize them for their work. So number 5 here is often these programs are not funded properly. They're not supported. They're funded in name, or people like the idea, and then they come and go. And you get these programs that have a name for it. I don't like the name. It's called stillbirth programs. They come into being, they fizzle, and they go away. Come into being, and so people spend all this money, state, politics, everybody's spending money on all this stuff. Come into being and they leave. They come into being and they leave. So we think a better approach would be to have to provide the long-term kind of thinking window in terms of funding, in terms of putting people in place that will help work on those programs. And in a community, this can come down to the, particular, for example, a person is a clerk, simply takes and keeps a record of things that were happening. You're going to need that to be able to pass that from one, generation of practitioners to the next, and one set of, year to the next, like to have continuity there. Just to give you an example. Number 6 here, that whenever you can do things for lower cost, look for the lower cost procedures. This is in dispute systems design generally. If you can do things by meeting and talking, that's better than going off to some formal procedure where you're spending a lot of money on lawyers and so forth. So often it's better to find these low cost procedures and high quality, low cost, right? High quality, where this thing works well. That's better for a community society. Now it's got its resources can be funneled to other more useful, things it needs to handle. So one should look closely at that as well. So number 7. Number 7 is all about, this is, reformulate, expand the definition of success. A lot of times in the criminal justice world, people talk about recidivism, the reoffending rate, and reducing the reoffending rate. Well, that's the big thing. Did it read? What's the numbers? What are the stats? What's the bottom line stats? What did it reduce them from 30 to 20? And people start comparing. Now it is useful to look at numbers and to say, okay, it's working. It's bringing down suicide rate or crime rate. But the thing is, with the CAKE program and others like it, they're looking at success in a broader sense. Like, yes, it does include reducing those things, but what about social solidarity? Building cohesion in a community, building skills, having people talk to each other. Those circles, the peacemaking circles, do a lot more than simply look at numbers on a page that reduce the instance of something. They're doing a lot more. So we should be, because the reality is more complex than that. We need to look and think more, broadly about success and what should constitute success or not. Number 8, focus on restorative practice instead of restorative justice. So better to focus on the practices, because then you can start to look at traditions. You can look at traditional knowledge, things that have now become important, things you can look to as practices that perhaps were already in existence, could be developed for the new world, the modern world and all that going forward. Rather than restorative justice, it's the term used in universities, we think is problematic. In fact, you know, a number of people have said, people that invented the term restorative justice have told me that they wish they'd never invented that term because they say it became like a brand. And what happened is it ended up being a one size fits, it's sort of that one size top down imposed. And they really are concerned about the idea of, you know, art, but people say in university now for shorthand, they say heuristic, they say, oh, it's RJ. But it's better really in our view to focus on practices because it's those practices you want to develop. And by the way, you know, a lot of the Native people say, well, you know, what is restorative justice? Why don't we just get regular justice? We don't need all these adjectives, just justice, right? Like, and then the other idea is it going to become, from the constitutional lawyer perspective, is we have restorative justice. Is that like Coke and Pepsi and then Coke Light or Pepsi Light? I mean, you don't get all the constitutional guarantees, you know, right? You get shuffled up into some back room. So there are really reasons why when we use those terms, we should be careful and how we think about things because they really are the practices we're talking about. And yes, hopefully together, working together, those things will result in more net substantive and procedural justice and all those good things. But let's focus on practices because that we can do something about. And also, one thing I think of is it stops there are many charlatans in all aspects, as you know, in all aspects of life and industries and so forth. And restorative justice isn't immune to this. And so you get people coming in and they're, you know, they're RJ people, they're restorative, but that can be a cover for a lot of other things. And so I get concerned about that. And I think, you know, Polly and I have discussed this quite a bit, that really by keeping it focused on practices, we actually know what the person's talking about, what they're committed to, what they're, you know, and if it's in a community, what those practices, it's honoring those practices in that community. So anyway, that's number 8. Number 9, the last one here is in the CAKE program, people brought, like Harold and Phil, they discussed cultural, that's the thing they did. They discussed cultural Tlingit norms, practices, traditions. And that's what made it so meaningful to people. And so we think that for local restorative programs, they need to have that focus on cultural norms, working with the court system, working with the judges, working with everybody's on the same page, we're all agreeing, prosecutor, if it's a criminal case, prosecutor, defense, social worker, school teacher, judge, the defendant, the victim. Says, you know, we think this is a good thing. We think we all agree that this is a good case for this matter, and we think it's going to be good for everybody. So by getting agreement, while respecting those cultural norms and practices, you actually have a very powerful program and something that's very sustainable. And so we think these 9 principles then were our conclusion in the article, where we determined, we thought these are the things people should think about for practitioners helping communities, but also, and politicians, policymakers. We also thought it would be useful for communities and villages themselves to, when they're looking back to traditions, to think about these things as well, so that they are supported in their work as well. So those are the 9 principles. Here's Mike Jackson. He's the grizzly bear on the right. That's Mike, and I'm on the left there. We're holding, and that's, by the way, that's one of the oldest totem poles in Alaska. So there's Mike was telling me the whole story of it. That's in the village of Cake in that small village. So this is the in a nutshell, these are the things to think about and why these 2 different programs had different results. And the questions or comments, I'll turn over the floor now. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Brian. And I think Arman has issued that call for people who may have questions.
Hey, Dr. Jarrett, Melissa here out of San Diego. I just wanted to thank you for, hey, how's it going? It's great to finally see you. Hey. Thank you for the lecture today. I actually have been doing this work in several countries around the world for the last 2 years prior to coming into the program. And it can often feel like swimming upstream when you're trying to explain to people the difference between the ineffective top-down approach and the very effective, but somewhat maybe considered progressive in certain circles, bottom-up approach. And you did such a beautiful job of laying it out in a really understandable way. So I just want to thank you for putting this on today.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and it really is important. This is the thing. People, you think, well, these are obvious principles, but what happens is that the moment people try to put a program in, I think there's sort of a race to, to look to the professionals to help. And what happens is the professionals, they reproduce the knowledge they know, right? Everybody reproduces the knowledge that we know. We reproduce what we know and do. So if you're a lawyer, you reproduce generally, you're not necessarily meaning harm, or but you reproduce what you know. And so so these systems can become legalistic if they're simply based on legal norms, for example. And so that becomes a problem. On the other hand, there's this other tension where you want to work with the courts and the systems and get people of good mind, goodwill, judges of goodwill. You'd be surprised how many judges are very pro working with the restorative side. And Mike told me that too in Alaska with the Superior Court judge. People came in, they took it seriously and were, really wanted to make and give Mike and the community room to make it work, and we're supporting. So
yeah, I've found that if you can get somebody to buy into the concept just even a little bit, it's so effective that really a lot of my discussions with those types of individuals that we bump up against are about addressing effectiveness. And that just seems to cross the legal norm, the scientific norm, the heavy hitter Harvard, Princeton, Yale, argument norm. Because when I ask them, I agree and I understand why you've adopted this principle, but let's look at the effectiveness. Right. And when I can approach it that way, people seem to be more willing because people want to be effective. They do. Yeah.
And, and for people working as, if you're asked, the community helps you to say, ask you to come in and say, can you help, do something? I think coming in with a kind of a humble attitude, and maybe I don't know and I really need to listen a lot and, to get to know what's going on is really a useful thing to do, because first of all, it lets people know that you're there, trying to understand, what's really going on. And secondly, that it does actually help, because you now say, okay, there's these theories, but theories always need, adapting.
It's important to show them that you're making informed suggestions or attempts, and we call that making sure you don't lead with the chin.
And then and there are people like Harold, for example, who was in the system. Harold Gadsby he readily tells people, I was in the system, I was in criminal university. He said, and that guy's brilliant. I mean, the guy is brings so much to understanding and so forth. His brother Phil, they do great work. They're good people. So, by the way, they've been given a medal by the royal family in England, because of all of their work in Europe, like of all the different projects they're involved in. Now they've taken peacemaking, they've gone and talked to other groups in Europe and so forth, and made a huge difference in people's lives. So, but again, they're humble too. Like they'd come about this stuff in a, we're all here to learn approach. But I think there is a danger of the professional. There's a danger of the idea that because we rely on professionals, and it's important. It's professional knowledge is good. It's not a bad thing at all. But on the other hand, we let the professional lead in situations where like this, where you need a tailored kind of solution and you need all these different inputs and data points and just traditional knowledge and all those things that are useful, that could get lost in there when you just have this professional approach, and the top-down professional thing particularly I think is not going to work so well in. We're always looking at what works, right? What's useful for people, what work, what helps people. And so that's where the focus should always be. So,
Thank you, Dr. Jarrett.
you bet. Yeah. Thanks. Other questions? Anybody interested in going to Alaska now and going? I really recommend hiking up there. It is gorgeous, just beautiful, lots of good people, and just a great place to be. So, particularly in the summer, not the winter so much. Other questions or comments? Something you liked, disliked, something that struck you the right or wrong way, and how are you in John? You're in Edinburgh. Are you in Edinburgh? How are you doing, by the way? Just checking in. John Swarbrick.
Hey, Brian, I had to come in and mute. I'm doing great. Good to see you back and fascinated to hear about your work up there. And
Thanks,
I've definitely hiked Alaska, and I would commend it to anybody. Beautiful place.
Thank you. Yeah. Miguel, do you have a question? Your hand's raised. Go ahead.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. And a comment or question that I had is based on the information that you provided.
Yeah.
It's do the citizens or people who live in those villages where there is essentially no policing,
Yeah.
do they create like in Mexico where there's low confidence or no trust of police, or
Right.
there is no presence of police to
Right.
protect the citizens? They
Right.
create these groups called autodefensas, or self defense groups
Oh, wow.
that
Yeah.
police their own communities and try to keep criminals out and this and that. So is there anything of that sort happening in those villages where they create their own self-defense groups, whether they're armed or unarmed?
Yeah. It's a good question. There in Alaska, it's interesting because they have these system of village police safety officers, VPSOs. And what they do is, this will be, until recently, by the way, they were the only person in the village who wasn't armed. Like they weren't allowed to have guns, and they were sort of a person who was not a police officer, but a semi-police officer. They would have some powers locally in that they came up with a system called the VPSOs, a village police safety officer, and they would attempt to police, and then they would refer matters to the state troopers, who would then fly in a helicopter usually. What happened was, here's the problem, that they're often drawn from somebody in the community, and there's a clan system in those communities. So if they're coming from one family, then they're seen as biased against other families or other clans. There's a danger. So people don't want to, and then you don't want to call the police on your relatives. Like, it's a natural thing not to want to call your, police on your relatives, right? Even if you think, oh, it's a problem, I don't want to get the guy in trouble. So there's a problem with that in terms of bias and the way that's designed. So they did have something called the VPSOs, the village safety police officers, and they, unfortunately, there were a lot of instances where they got into trouble. And one of the big ones you can read about historically is in the village of Tanana, which I don't know if Polly's on, but she could speak to this, where a guy, they had one of the VPSOs apparently was in a scuffle with somebody a guy in the village in Tanana, and it gets escalated. And now what to do? Calls the state troopers. Of course, it takes them a while to come in, but it's escalating all the while. And then they finally come in by helicopter. That safety police officer is now wrestling in the kitchen with this guy in his house. Goes right to his house, to his porch, right into his house. It's a question of, was that all legitimate to start with? But anyways, he's now the kid sees this, and I believe that the boy, like a 16-year-old, he had FAS, some fetal, where you have less inhibition because of it. Anyways, he sees his dad now wrestling with the safety police officer. He gets his gun, and a shotgun comes down, and by now the police officers have finally arrived. And while the police officers are making an arrest, the son comes down, shoots both in the back, and kills both of the police officers, and oddly enough leaves the village safety police officer alone, because he begs for his life basically. And but the two state troopers are killed, and they were known. These were people who played in the community. They played basketball with the kids. They were really good people. They worked with the dog. Everybody in the community, that the dogs, they were on the dogs that would teach people how to. People knew them and really liked them everywhere in Alaska, and particularly in that community. So the community was really upset about this because they, but it's an example that's the Tanana case is an example where it just all went wrong. And it's not, that's one case of a number where it goes wrong, because there's all these miscommunications and so forth. And then the boy comes down seeing his dad being wrestled with and so forth. Got to take matters into my own hand. And so there's one tragic event after another. And that really shook Alaska up, because people, as I say, knew everybody, knew those families, and these were good people all around. And so anyways, there's a real disconnect when that happens. And some other cases I could tell you about, but it can often be tragic. So there's these attempts to have a local police officer, but sometimes it can, obviously, if you've got clan system and you have families, you have to be careful, because then they can start to become, there can be real rivalries start with one family versus another. So that's also not a good dynamic as well, because you want people to get along, right? So that's a tricky situation. But it's called the VPSO system. So that's how they try to manage it, but it's got some problems. Other comments or questions? Thanks, Miguel. I appreciate the question. Other comments or questions? Isn't this an exciting topic? It's an interesting, really look at restorative work from as I say, the local perspective versus the macro political perspective, where people have agendas and so forth. They maybe use restorative justice in ways that perhaps the local community doesn't want to use. So there really is an important place for people to develop these programs from the community, from the ground up. So that's the conclusion, that we came up with in our work. And Polly Hyslop, a quick shout out to Polly Hyslop, who is working. She was at the University of Alaska. She's Athabaskan Dene. She's a member of the status member of the Tanana community, of the Northway community, and the White River First Nations in the Yukon. And she's doing terrific work up there. So that name, just remember that name, Polly Hyslop, Hyslop. I'll just write it in here because that's she's somebody who's doing terrific work. She's currently the executive director for the Healing Native Hearts Coalition. It does work in domestic violence, and so they're looking at ways to resolve and to address matters of domestic violence. A lot of people say that you can't. They don't want people to look at domestic violence or to look at violence generally through restorative lens. I think there's room. There is, again, it's a matter. It's not a one size fits all. It's not blanket. It's, again, tailoring measures. And you can see that, again, the cake example is a good example where things are tailored. That's when things work. So other comments or questions?
Brian, I think you did a fantastic job. Any last thought before we call everybody to give them any final thoughts?
Just to thank you, Hamoud, and your support and friendship. And Armand, thank you also very much for supporting this work and through this venue. We need more discussion at universities on these matters. And I think, programs that look serious at these matters, not as cartoons or caricatures or ideological perspectives, but actually people oriented from the ground up, working with people and keeping that focus. And that is the key to going ahead, I think, in the larger political perspective as well. So thanks very much, Hamid. Thank you to everybody for coming too.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I think, Armand, if we don't have anything, we're done today, right?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us today. It was an excellent conversation and discussion with Dr. Jarrett. So we appreciate you being here with us.